Kia ora koutou, welcome to this recording on the policy cycle. Let's start with a whakatauki. Poipoia te kakano kia puawai. Achieving dreams and goals requires work to be put in. I hope as you're continuing through the semester, you're maintaining good study routines and habits so you can keep reaching for your study goals. Please feel free to contact me at any time if you want to chat about any aspects of the course. The purpose of this topic is to explore the notion of a policy cycle. While many policy issues are characterised by a key decision event, such as a ministerial announcement or the passage of a piece of legislation, the vast majority of policy issues evolve through a series of stages or sequences. And these are sometimes known as the stagist model, or if we think of them as sequences, a policy cycle. Stages tend to give the impression that this is a rather static process, whereas cycle is rather more fluid. At different times and in different combinations, the stages of the cycle comprise a process that involves a wide range of stakeholder groups, including politicians, public servants, and members of the public. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. The policy cycle was first proposed by Harold Lasswell in 1956. It's sometimes described as a normative approach as it's concerned with what should happen, and so it's informed by values. The cycle is rational in that it follows a set of logical steps. When we think about the process of policy making, we may wonder, is it feasible to gather information on all possible alternatives and all possible consequences? Can we actually know everything that could be done to address a certain issue? Lindblom, another key academic in this field, argues for an incremental approach to policy making, where policy builds on existing policy, and so small steps are agreed to rather than there being massive changes. We also need to be aware that policy is not made in a vacuum, but it's influenced by values of politicians, interest groups, and others who are endeavouring to influence policy decisions. It can also be influenced by domestic or international factors. The COVID-19 pandemic is a good example of a worldwide health issue that's having a significant impact on the development of policies in Aotearoa. Domestically, here in Aotearoa, the housing crisis is another domestic issue. There isn't enough adequate housing for everyone, and so this is also influencing policy developments in the housing area. Can you think of a value of the Labour Party that the current government is aiming to demonstrate in their policies? I think well-being or equity is one of their values. We can see this value evident in the naming of their previous budgets as the well-being budgets, and also the focus on alleviating child poverty. They're the first government to have a minister given the portfolio of child poverty reduction. As it happens, the Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Jacinda Ardern, holds this portfolio, and perhaps this also signals the importance she's placing on this area. Can you think of some other values that the Labour Party holds that you might see coming through in their policies? The policy cycle is only one of a number of ways in which we can conceive of the interactions and dynamics out of which social policy emerges. But it is, I think, one of the most useful ones. It's known as the stages approach because it conceives policy development as passing through a number of stages. And its primary advantage is that it allows us to identify different events that occur in the life cycle of a policy issue. Some advantages of the policy cycle is that it is an explanatory tool that can help us make sense of the general pattern of policy development. Essentially, it's a map to help you navigate the policy-making process. I think it's useful to be able to memorise the stages of the policy cycle, and to do this I use an acronym: All Frogs Delight in Eggs. A for agenda setting, all; F for formulating policy, frogs; D, delight, decision making; N, I, implementation; and E, eggs, evaluation. So that acronym is All Frogs Delight in Eggs. Let's have a little look at each of the stages. First stage we often talk about is agenda setting. So the agenda setting stage is when private issues are transformed into public concerns. Let's take housing again as an example. The limited supply of housing for people in Aotearoa has meant for the government that it needs to consider how it may or may not intervene in the housing market to ensure that all citizens can access adequate housing. They have a particular interest in ensuring this, as the evidence shows that people living in overcrowded housing also have poorer health and educational outcomes. This again impacts on the amount of money that the government needs to spend on supporting its citizens. The government has a responsibility to ensure that citizens are supported with their health and education, and therefore this may also extend to ensuring they have adequate housing. Policy ideas or issues may be contested by a whole range of people. These may include interest groups, private sector firms, unions, political parties, officials, and individuals. These groups and individuals may have quite different perspectives on what the issue is and also how it should be addressed. These people may lobby MPs, make submissions to select committees, shape public opinion through the media. To have their ideas progress, they will need a sympathetic ear in Parliament or in government. When we think of who can influence or drive what goes on the government's policy agenda, we can think of them in terms of those who sit within government and those who are external. Internal policy drivers are those people who are part of government. This includes ministers and their ideas, maybe coalition agreements that they have with other political parties, and advice from policy advisors and officials. And these can all influence whether a particular issue is seen by the government as a priority. This is a bit more complex with MMP, our electoral system, as the government needs to keep on side with potentially more political parties. Officials are in a good place to notice change that may need to be made to a policy or other directions a policy could take, so they're often relied upon for good advice and evidence. External policy drivers may include lobbying by interest groups, judicial reviews by judges, the state of the domestic economy, and international events, for example, terrorism, a refugee crisis, or the pandemic. So in terms of the management of this stage, ministers and senior officials have a stake in what goes on the political agenda. They may have particular issues they want to pursue that may reflect the policies of their political party or from evaluations of ongoing policy implementation. The more persuasive ministers might have more of their policies looked at. And there's also a hierarchy of ministers, so more senior ministers may also get their issues considered more often or in more depth. The formulating policy stage of the cycle is all about considering different options as to how the problem or the issue could be resolved. This means the decision makers, so that's the ministers and cabinet, just need a good understanding of the nature of the problem, different options for addressing the issue, and what evidence there is to suggest one option should be decided upon over another. Ministers therefore need robust policy analysis, and this will come from a variety of people. I've already mentioned officials. So government departments have policy researchers and analysts who can gather evidence and make suggested recommendations. Their primary job is to collect information on a particular policy issue, for instance, how to address child poverty. They need to make sense of the issue and think about possible ways in which the issue could be addressed or resolved. And then they present this information in a usable format. Policy advice may also come from consultants, interest groups, political advisors, and those are advisors who are employed by the government and so are likely to be more attuned to the values of the government and what's likely to be seen as an acceptable approach to addressing an issue. Individual experts might also have some influence. The government could also hold discussions with coalition partners if they have them, and consult with public agencies that will be affected by the policy. For example, Kāinga Ora may be consulted around the possible implementation of new policy related to housing. Ministers don't have to act on the advice they receive. They will consider what's okay with the electorate, so that's us, the public. They really need to listen to public opinion if they wish to be voted back into Parliament in the next election. They'll also think about their party policy direction and manifesto. So that is what is their policy look like in terms of their political party? What did they say before the elections that they were going to do as well? To fully understand a decision taken, you need to know who influenced the process. So, for example, with changes in Ministry for Children, Oranga Tamariki, you need to understand the importance of voice, V-O-Y-C-E. And these are the young people who'd been in state care and who had the ear of Minister Anne Tolley at the time that OT was undergoing significant change. So this will all be part of what you'll be considering in your final assignment. The next stage of the policy cycle is the decision-making stage. This stage is about who decides whether to act, that is to implement one of the many options, or not to act, so maybe stay with the status quo. Remember that this is what policymaking is all about, to act or not to act, and thinking about the use of scarce resources. So even by not changing anything, the government is still making a decision about a particular policy issue. In Aotearoa, the significant policy decisions are made in Cabinet. Before a decision is made, the different policy options would have been examined in a Cabinet committee. Policy is shaped here. In Cabinet collective decision making, there needs to be a consensus amongst the ministers. And if there isn't a consensus, then they may agree to disagree. Remember the concept of collective ministerial responsibility that was discussed earlier in the course. This means that once a decision has been made by Cabinet, even if a minister doesn't agree with it personally, they need to support it in public. There are many influencing factors in the decision-making stage, so ministers have to consider the risks, costs, benefits, trade-offs about adopting a particular approach to address an issue. Most policy options will have pros and cons, and of course it will never please everyone, so the Cabinet needs to be certain they have the evidence and rationale for their decision, so that when the decision is scrutinised, often by the media, they can justify their decision. Formalising the decision may mean that regulations or legislation is made, or perhaps a new program is introduced or altered. There will often be announcements by ministers, so the public is made aware of the decision. The directives made by Cabinet to implement a decision are written in the minutes of the Cabinet meeting, and these are publicly available if asked for under the Official Information Act. Okay, so moving along, the next stage is about implementation of the decision. In this stage, the government has to decide what policy instrument may be the best tool or tools to tackle the policy program. We often categorise policy instruments into several different areas. Firstly, we can think about voluntary policy instruments, and these include private markets. For example, Chorus is an organisation who take care of phone lines, fibre, etc. Families and whānau, for example, Parents as First Teachers, and these parents support families and whānau with their parenting and hope to improve children's and families' outcomes. Or communities like Neighbourhood Watch, and also iwi organisations who have taken on considerable mahi relating to vaccination of Māori instead of the government primarily working with these whānau, hapu and iwi. The next type of policy instrument is a mixed policy instrument, and this may include information like campaigns, consultations like and hui, user charges, so for example, general practitioners' fees. So when we go to the doctor, we have to pay partial fees for them. Subsidies, so these are paid to like tertiary providers. On every certain number of enrolments we have, we get a certain amount of money from the government. Contracting services, for example, the contracting out of health services to iwi organisations or other community services. And public-private partnerships. So, for example, in roading construction, might have some oversight by the government, but the actual work is done by roading organisations. These examples indicate there is a relationship between the government and another sector or provider, so that's the mixed element. Next, there are what is known as compulsory policy instruments. These primarily relate to legislation or regulation, which may regulate behaviour. So, for example, smoking legislation, where you can and can't smoke. They might also affect some form of institutional change. For example, the Supreme Court Act 2003 brought the Supreme Court into being. We didn't previously have a Supreme Court in Aotearoa. May also regulate relationships. For example, the Prostitution Reform Act, Civil Union Act as well, means that the government is saying that certain relationships are okay. Prostitution is not criminal behaviour anymore. People are able to be married in terms of a civil union or marriage now. Regulations and legislation may also help resolve disputes. So, for example, the Ngāi Tahu Claims Settlement 1998 is part of the agreement between the Crown and Ngāi Tahu around what was rightfully theirs under Te Tiriti o Waitangi. And finally, taxation is another policy instrument that influences the economy. It also generates revenue, so that's income for the government, provides incentives, so tax increases to discourage drinking or smoking, or it may redistribute wealth, so the use of benefits or subsidies for people who may not have enough money to be able to meet their basic needs. The Bright Line test in the housing sector is a way to tax the financial gains people make when they buy and sell a house for income. So it's just like paying tax on another income you might have. Currently, the Bright Line test comes into play if people sell an investment property within 5 years of buying it. So that's another example of taxation as a policy instrument. Sometimes the government will also decide that service provision should be done by the public sector so as to meet gaps where no alternative providers exist. So this may also minimise risks associated with failures in delivery. So, for example, Oranga Tamariki is tasked with determining whether a child is in need of care and protection. They do the assessments, the social workers there, to determine child safety, and then they may contract other providers, for example, the Open Home Foundation, to undertake foster care or parenting work or other casework with the child. Who delivers or implements the policy is often influenced by values. For example, the National Party favours public-private partnerships. Labour generally prefers more state intervention and oversight, and then utilises community partnerships to support their work. For example, Oranga Tamariki liaising and contracting out to community organisations. Implementation of a particular policy may not be perfect, and sometimes there may be gaps in implementation or unanticipated consequences that then need to be addressed. And that leads on to our last stage. So the last stage is evaluation. So essentially this stage considers two forms of evaluation. Firstly, process evaluation. This considers whether what is being implemented is being delivered as planned. And secondly, impact or outcome evaluation. So what has been achieved and does it fit with the policy intention? So is it meeting the goals of what it was decided to be implemented in the first place? Evaluations may be done by government departments or contracted to consultants, or be done by other interested observers such as interest groups, think tanks or non-government organisations. Evaluation should consider the impact of policy on the objectives around what was trying to be addressed. So that makes total sense, doesn't it? That if you're going to implement something, particularly if it's going to cost a lot of money, you want to know that it's actually doing what it needs to do and meeting the objectives that it was set up for. So part of an evaluation is to consider would what has been implemented be maintained, modified or terminated. So is it okay the way it is, or does there need to be some changes? Often there's a lack of evaluation. So an example of this was that in 2003, the Social Workers Registration Board Act went through Parliament and was implemented, but there's never been an evaluation that I'm aware of anyway on the impact of social work registration on service users. So the whole purpose of that act was to better protect the public from social workers, but I certainly haven't seen any evaluations that suggest whether it has actually met that objective or not. Okay, so that's the 5 stages of the policy cycle, and that's probably about enough talking from me for a moment. So what I'd like you to do now is just have a go at writing down what you understand at the moment about the housing policy in New Zealand. And that may not be very much, and that's fine. And see if you can link your knowledge that you have, or maybe after a quick Google, to the different stages of the policy cycle. So, for example, why or how has housing become a key policy issue in Aotearoa? What are some ideas that have been suggested to address housing issues? And I'll give you one example, and you can find some others. The idea of a warrant of fitness for rental accommodation. What is one policy around housing that's been accepted by Cabinet, implemented, and how have they decided to do this? So you might want to pause now and just spend a little bit of time looking online around this important policy issue and take some notes just for your own learning and thinking about the different policy stages. Last couple of slides really. So there are some strengths and weaknesses of the policy cycle, and on the slide I've got some of the strengths there which show that it can be a useful way to navigate around a policy issue and see what decisions have been made or not around a specific policy issue. This helps to create a bit of order in what can be a really chaotic process. Being able to separate the stages and explore these in some detail can also be helpful in developing an understanding of a policy issue and how the government may be addressing it, and also whether progress is being made. It can also help to bring policy a bit more alive and help us understand what's actually happening in the policy arena. There are, however, some weaknesses of the model, and I've just jotted down some of the thoughts around that as well. So, for instance, the model doesn't enable us to explore the values, biases, preferences that may be held by the different people, groups or communities who are endeavouring to influence policy decisions. The idea of policy making happening neatly in a cycle or series of stages is also not quite accurate. Policy making is messy. And so when a policy issue comes onto the government's agenda, it may also go off the agenda again, especially if a more pressing issue comes along, like a pandemic. A policy option could also begin to get implemented, and then a new government may be elected and have other preferences, and so may stop a program and decide on a new approach. Then it might go back to the drawing board as such, and they might go through that policy formulation stage all over again. Similarly, decisions may be made and then new information come to light, and so a new decision may supersede a previous one. Or the policymakers may go back to the policy formulation stage and want to consider different policy options. So overall, while this cycle is useful for us as we learn more about who is involved in policy making and how it can happen, it isn't quite as neat and tidy as what we've been thinking about it as today. Some final thoughts about policy making. While the government may have lots of evidence and information about a policy issue and ways in which it might effectively, hopefully, be addressed, governments may not have control over other variables. So that may include the economy, international and domestic events such as natural disasters, terrorism, stock market crashes or pandemics, and these may all exert influence on what is sitting on the government's policy agenda, as well as what will be prioritised and resources and money will be spent on. So thinking about things more recently, if the government hadn't needed to spend significant amounts of money on COVID responses, then they could have decided to spend those funds on other policy priorities such as welfare, housing, education, roading, and so on and so on. Existing policy also constrains what government might decide to do. Legislation cannot be simply overturned by the government, as it has to go through Parliament by means of the legislative process, which we talked about a bit earlier in the course. By the time this goes through Select Committee and the different readings in the House, the intent of new laws may have changed quite considerably. Of course, this in part depends on whether the government has a substantial majority in the House and so can get legislation through more quickly or not. As you're listening to the news, reading the spin-off or other online material, consider when people are talking about policy issues and decisions and how they've come to be on the government's agenda, if they are. You may also come across some policy issues that actually the government is not taking any attention of. And you may be involved in some interest groups where you may feel like that's happening, that the cause that you're interested in is not being taken seriously enough by the government. Also think about who may be influencing government decision making. So for example, are they farmers, business people, environmental interest groups, and so on? And what values or ideologies may be influencing the decisions that are being made? Try and take a more critical approach to considering the policy issues you identify. For example, a relevant topic for all of you, should tertiary students pay fees to attend university? That's a policy issue. Why do you think they should, or why do you think they shouldn't? And should medicine and law students pay more than a social work student to get their degree, or a BA student? Why or why not? And what values are informing your views around this? Ministers are also having to weigh up the answers to these questions and make decisions about what should or shouldn't be done. Final slide. So in this topic, we've considered the 5 stages of Lasswell's policy cycle, which is one way to consider how policy making occurs. We've also touched on the strengths and weaknesses of the cycle. It's really important that you feel like you understand each of the 5 stages and some of the key actors, policy actors in each of the stages. So they're the people or groups or communities that are involved. This will be the foundation for your final assignment. And anyway, it's important for you to understand so that you can better understand policy making. Ngā mihi nui, Kath.